Lucky Luciano hung up the telephone, and his face turned to ice. The year was 1936, and the most powerful mobster in America had just made a decision that would either expand his empire or ignite a war he couldn't win. "Finish Bumpy Johnson tonight," he said to the four men standing in his Manhattan office. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were specialists, men who had eliminated targets from Chicago to Miami without leaving a trace. 4 professional killers, 4 men who had never failed a single assignment. Luciano pointed to a map of Harlem spread across his desk. "He's running numbers out of a pool hall on 134th Street. Make it clean, make it quiet, and make sure he doesn't see the sunrise." The 4 men nodded and walked out into the cold February night. They had their orders. They had their weapons. What they didn't have was any idea who they were really dealing with. By morning, Lucky Luciano would receive another phone call, but this time the voice on the other end would be Bumpy Johnson himself, and the single sentence he spoke would freeze Luciano's blood solid. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Harlem in 1936. The Great Depression had crushed America, but Harlem was fighting back the only way it knew how. The numbers game, an illegal lottery, where people bet pennies on 3-digit numbers, had become the economic engine of the entire neighborhood. Poor families who couldn't afford bread would scrape together nickels and dimes, hoping that their number would hit and change their lives. The numbers racket generated millions of dollars every year. And in 1936, that money was controlled by 2 people. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Caribbean immigrant they called the Queen of Numbers, and her chief enforcer, a 30-year-old man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The streets called him Bumpy because of a bump on the back of his head from a childhood injury. But that nickname had taken on new meaning over the years. Bumpy. Johnson didn't just have a physical bump. He had a way of creating bumps in the plans of anyone who tried to cross him. Dutch Schultz had learned that lesson the hard way. Now Lucky Luciano was about to learn it too. Lucky Luciano wasn't just any gangster. He was the man who had reorganized the entire American Mafia. In 1931, he had orchestrated the murders of the 2 most powerful mob bosses in New York, establishing himself as the chairman of the Commission, the governing body of organized crime. Luciano had modernized the mob, turning it from a collection of warring families into a corporation of crime. He controlled gambling, prostitution, and labor unions across the eastern seaboard. His reach extended from New York to Cuba, from politicians to police commissioners. But there was one territory that remained stubbornly outside his control: Harlem. Dutch Schultz had tried to take Harlem's numbers racket in 1933 and 1934. He had sent enforcers, bribed politicians, even kidnapped some of Madame St. Clair's bankers. For a while, it looked like Schultz would succeed. But then something happened. Bumpy Johnson happened. One by one, Schultz's operations in Harlem began to fail. His collectors were beaten. His drop points were raided. His men started disappearing. By October 1935, Dutch Schultz was dead, gunned down in a Newark tavern. And Bumpy Johnson was still standing. Luciano had watched Schultz's failure with interest. The German mobster had been reckless, arrogant, too willing to use violence without strategy. Luciano considered himself different. He was a businessman first, a gangster second. He believed that every problem could be solved through negotiation, through finding mutual benefit. So in January 1936, he sent an emissary to Harlem with a simple proposal: partnership. Luciano would provide protection, political connections, and banking services. In return, he wanted 40% of the numbers' profits. It was a reasonable offer, Luciano thought. Generous even. Madame St. Clair never responded. Instead, she sent Bumpy Johnson to meet with Luciano's representative. The meeting took place in a restaurant on 125th Street. Bumpy arrived alone, wearing a tailored gray suit and a fedora tilted at a precise angle. He listened to the proposal without expression. When the emissary finished speaking, Bumpy stood up, straightened his jacket, and said 4 words: Harlem is not interested." Then he walked out, leaving his coffee untouched. That night, Luciano's representative was found in an alley with both legs broken. No one saw who did it. No one ever did. The insult burned in Luciano's chest for weeks. He wasn't used to being rejected. He wasn't used to being ignored, and he certainly wasn't used to having his men beaten like common street thugs. His advisors urged patience. "Harlem isn't worth a war," Meyer Lansky told him. "The numbers money is good, but it's not worth the blood." But Luciano couldn't let it go. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about respect. If a black enforcer in Harlem could reject Lucky Luciano and get away with it, what message did that send to everyone else? What would the other families think? What would his enemies think? No, this required a response, not a negotiation, not a deal. A demonstration. Luciano called in 4 of his most reliable men. Tommy Greco, a Sicilian immigrant who had killed 11 men for the organization, Vincent Marino, a former boxer whose fists had crushed skulls in basement fights across Brooklyn, Sal Benedetto, a knife specialist who could gut a man in 3 seconds flat, and Dominic Caruso, the youngest of the group, a cold-eyed killer who never spoke and never missed. These 4 men had handled problems in Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. Bumpy Johnson would be their easiest assignment yet. February 17th, 1936. The night was bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping below 20 degrees. The 4 men drove up to Harlem in a black Packard, their weapons concealed beneath heavy wool coats. Tommy Greco was behind the wheel, his jaw tight with focus. The others sat in silence, each man running through the plan in his mind. They had been watching Bumpy for 3 days. They knew his routines, his haunts, his habits. Every Tuesday night, Bumpy played poker in the back room of a pool hall on 134th Street. He usually left around midnight, walked 2 blocks to his apartment, alone. That was the window. 2 blocks, 60 seconds. 1 clean shot to the head, and Harlem's greatest problem would be solved. The Packard parked on 133rd Street, engine idling. The men waited, watching the pool hall's entrance through the foggy windows. At 11:45, they saw movement. A figure emerged from the pool hall, buttoning his coat against the cold. Gray suit, fedora, the distinctive silhouette of Bumpy Johnson. Tommy Greco smiled. "That's him. Let's go." The 4 men stepped out into the frozen night, their breath forming clouds in the air. They spread out, approaching from different angles, cutting off every escape route. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly, deliberately, his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem to notice the 4 men converging on him. He didn't seem to notice the black Packard that had been following him for 3 days. He just walked, his footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. When he reached the corner of 134th and Lenox Avenue, he stopped. The 4 men stopped too, surprised. Bumpy turned around, facing them directly. His face was calm, almost peaceful. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "I was wondering when you'd make your move." Tommy Greco's hand went to his waistband. "You know why we're here." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Luciano sent you. 4 men for 1 target. He must think highly of me." Vincent Marino stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You can make this easy or hard. Your choice." Bumpy looked at each man in turn, studying their faces as if memorizing them. Then he did something that none of them expected. He smiled. "Before you do something you can't take back," Bumpy said quietly. "I want to show you something. It'll only take a minute. After that, if you still want to kill me, I won't stop you." Tommy Greco laughed. "You think we're stupid. You think we're going to let you lead us into some trap." Bumpy shook his head. "No trap. Just information. Information that Luciano needs to hear before he starts a war he can't win." The 4 men exchanged glances. This wasn't how targets usually behaved. Targets ran. Targets begged. Targets tried to fight. They didn't offer information. They didn't negotiate. Dominic Caruso, the silent one, spoke for the first time. "1 minute. Show us." Bumpy nodded and gestured toward a building across the street. There's a diner on the corner. Warm coffee, private booth. What I have to show you is better seen indoors. Tommy's instincts screamed at him to refuse. Every lesson he had learned in 20 years of killing told him to put a bullet in this man's head right now and be done with it. But something in Bumpy's eyes gave him pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was confidence. The kind of confidence that only comes from knowing something your enemy doesn't. Fine, Tommy said slowly. 1 minute. But try anything funny and you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Bumpy walked toward the diner. The 4 killers followed, their hands never leaving their weapons. The diner was nearly empty at midnight. A tired waitress leaned against the counter, barely glancing up as the 5 men entered. Bumpy led them to a booth in the back corner, sliding into the seat facing the door. Old habit. Always watch the entrance. Always know your exits. The 4 men squeezed into the opposite side, their bulk making the booth feel cramped. Tommy kept his hand on his pistol beneath the table. "Talk fast," he said. Bumpy reached slowly into his jacket pocket. All 4 men tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. But Bumpy didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table, face up. Tommy looked down at the image, and his face went pale. It was a photograph of a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, one of Luciano's primary gambling operations, and standing in front of it, clearly visible, shaking hands with a man in a police captain's uniform, was Tommy Greco himself. "Where did you get this?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. Bumpy reached into his pocket again. Another photograph. This one showed Vincent Marino leaving a brothel that Luciano operated in Midtown. A brothel that Luciano's wife didn't know existed. A third photograph. Sal Benedetto meeting with a known informant outside a courthouse. "I have 47 photographs," Bumpy said calmly. 47 images that show Luciano's operations, his connections, his vulnerabilities. I have pictures of his meetings with corrupt judges. I have pictures of his shipments coming into the harbor. I have pictures of his men doing things that would put them in Sing Sing for 20 years. He paused, letting the information sink in. I've been collecting these photographs for 3 years. Dutch Schultz never knew about them. Luciano doesn't know about them. Only 3 people in the world know where the originals are kept, and I'm one of them. Tommy Greco stared at the photographs, his mind racing. If these images got into the wrong hands, if a prosecutor or a newspaper reporter or a rival family got hold of them, Luciano's empire would crumble overnight. Everything they had built, everything they had killed for, would be destroyed. "What do you want?" Tommy asked, his voice hollow. Bumpy gathered the photographs and slipped them back into his pocket. "I want to talk to Luciano, face to face. No guns, no threats, just 2 businessmen having a conversation. You're going to arrange that meeting, and you're going to do it tonight." Tommy Greco had a decision to make. He could kill Bumpy Johnson right now, complete the assignment, and hope that the photographs were a bluff. Or he could do something he had never done before, disobey a direct order from Lucky Luciano. He looked at his 3 companions. Vincent's face was ashen. Sal was sweating despite the cold. Even Dominic, the stone-faced killer, looked uncertain. These weren't men who scared easily. But the photographs had changed everything. "If this is a trick," Tommy said slowly, "if you're leading us into an ambush or setting us up, I swear to God I'll hunt down everyone you've ever loved." Bumpy didn't flinch. "No tricks. No ambush. I'm offering Luciano something he can't get anywhere else. A partnership that actually works, one that makes us both rich instead of making us both dead." Tommy stood up from the booth, his legs unsteady. "Wait here. I need to make a phone call." He walked to the telephone booth at the front of the diner, dropped a nickel in the slot, and dialed a number he knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Yeah?" Tommy took a deep breath. "Boss, we have a situation. You need to hear this yourself." 3 hours later, At 4 in the morning, a meeting took place that would reshape the criminal landscape of New York. The location was a warehouse on the Harlem River, neutral territory controlled by neither the Italians nor the Harlem crews. Luciano arrived with 6 bodyguards, more men than he usually traveled with. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He had been pulled from his bed for this meeting, and he was not happy about it. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone. He walked into the warehouse with his hands visible, his coat open to show he carried no weapons. The gesture wasn't lost on Luciano. This was either the bravest man he had ever met or the craziest. "You've got balls," Luciano said, not offering his hand. "Coming here alone after what you did to my men." Bumpy stopped 10 feet from Luciano, close enough to talk, but far enough to give the bodyguards no excuse. "Your men are fine. A little shaken, but fine. I could have killed them. I chose not to." Luciano's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. The bodyguards raised their weapons instantly. But again, Bumpy didn't pull a gun. He pulled a folder thick with photographs and documents and placed it on a crate between them. "Everything I have on your organization," Bumpy said. 47 photographs, 16 financial records, 8 sworn statements from witnesses who would testify if subpoenaed. Enough to put you in prison for life. Enough to destroy the commission. Enough to start a war between the families that would make the Castellamaries look like a playground fight. Luciano stared at the folder, but didn't touch it. "And you're giving this to me? Why?" Bumpy shook his head. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm showing you what I have. The originals stay where they are, in a place your men will never find. If anything happens to me, if I die in an accident, if I disappear, if I so much as catch a cold that doesn't go away, those documents go to 3 places simultaneously: Thomas Dewey's office, the New York Times, and the Genovese family." The mention of Vito Genovese made Luciano's jaw tighten. Genovese was his underboss, but also his greatest potential rival. If Genovese got evidence of Luciano's operations, evidence that could be used as leverage, the balance of power would shift overnight. "You've thought this through," Luciano said quietly. Bumpy nodded. "I've had 3 years to think it through. 3 years, while Dutch Schultz was too busy making noise to notice I was gathering information." Luciano walked slowly around the crate, his eyes never leaving Bumpy's face. His bodyguards tracked his movement, their weapons still raised. "So what do you want? Money? Territory? Protection?" Bumpy shook his head. "I want to be left alone. Harlem stays independent. No Italian crews operating north of 110th Street. No tribute, no partnership percentages, no soldiers collecting from our businesses. Harlem runs itself, and you stay out." Luciano laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to give up a territory worth millions, just like that?" "I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm offering you something better." Bumpy pulled another document from the folder. It was a financial ledger, handwritten numbers filling every line. "This is what Dutch Schultz spent trying to take Harlem. Bribes to politicians, payoffs to police, salaries for soldiers, medical bills for the men we sent to the hospital, funeral costs for the ones we didn't." Luciano glanced at the numbers. His expression didn't change, but his eyes widened slightly. $237,000, Bumpy said. "That's what Schultz spent in 2 years, and he died without ever controlling a single numbers bank. I'm offering you a different deal." Bumpy pointed to the documents spread across the crate. "You leave Harlem alone. In exchange, I guarantee that my people will never operate south of 110th Street. We won't touch your gambling, your unions, your docks, and twice a year, I'll provide you with updated intelligence on police investigations, political shifts, anything that might threaten your operations, free of charge." Luciano studied Bumpy with new interest. This wasn't what he had expected. He had expected threats, demands, maybe even a physical confrontation. What he got was a businessman making a logical argument. "You're offering to be my intelligence service in Harlem." Bumpy nodded. I have eyes and ears in places your men will never reach. Porters at Grand Central who overhear conversations. Maids who clean the offices of prosecutors. Shoeshine boys outside police headquarters. I know things before they happen. That knowledge is worth more than any tribute money. The warehouse fell silent. Luciano's bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, waiting for orders. Finally, Luciano spoke. And if I say no, if I decide to take my chances and burn Harlem to the ground. Bumpy's expression didn't change. Then you lose everything. The photographs go public. Your empire collapses. And whoever survives the fallout will know that Lucky Luciano was brought down by one man who wouldn't bend. Luciano turned his back on Bumpy and walked to the warehouse window. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the Harlem River. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the water, his mind calculating odds and outcomes. His bodyguards watched nervously. This was unprecedented. Lucky Luciano didn't negotiate with anyone. He gave orders. He made demands. He took what he wanted. But this man, this Bumpy Johnson, had done something that no one else had ever managed. He had found leverage. Real leverage. The kind that couldn't be bought or threatened away. Luciano thought about Dutch Schultz, bleeding out on the floor of that Newark restaurant. He thought about the money. Schultz had wasted, the men Schultz had lost, the empire Schultz had never built. Dutch had tried force. Dutch had tried violence. Dutch had tried to crush Harlem under his heel, and Harlem had crushed him instead. Maybe, Luciano thought, there was another way, a smarter way. He turned back to face Bumpy Johnson. You keep your photographs. I keep my territory below 110th. Twice a year, you give me intelligence reports. And if you ever double-cross me, if those documents ever see the light of day, I'll burn Harlem with everyone in it. Bumpy nodded slowly. Agreed. Luciano walked to the crate and extended his hand. For a moment, Bumpy just looked at it. This was the hand that had ordered the deaths of dozens of men. The hand that had signed the execution orders of 2 mob bosses. The hand that controlled an empire of crime stretching from New York to Havana. Bumpy took it. They shook once firmly, then released. You got guts, Johnson, Luciano said. I'll give you that. Walking. In here alone, facing me down. Playing this game at this level. Most men would have run. Most men would have begged. Bumpy picked up the folder of documents and slipped it back into his coat. I'm not most men. Luciano almost smiled. No. No, you're not. He gestured to his bodyguards, and they lowered their weapons. Get out of here, before I change my mind. Bumpy walked toward the warehouse door, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. When he reached the exit, Luciano called out one last time. Johnson. Bumpy turned. Luciano's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something else there too. Something that might have been respect. If you were Italian, you'd be running your own family by now. Bumpy tipped his fedora. If I were Italian, Mr. Luciano, I wouldn't need to. The sun was rising over Harlem when Bumpy Johnson walked out of that warehouse. The streets were coming alive with early morning workers, delivery trucks, children heading to school. None of them knew what had happened that night. None of them knew how close their neighborhood had come to war. Bumpy walked for blocks, letting the cold morning air clear his head. He stopped at a newsstand on 125th Street and bought a newspaper, scanning the headlines. Nothing about crime. Nothing about Luciano. Nothing about the meeting that had just reshaped the underworld. He found a bench and sat down, watching Harlem wake up around him. An old woman swept the sidewalk in front of her apartment building. A group of men gathered outside a barber shop laughing at some joke. A young mother pushed a baby carriage down the street, humming a song Bumpy didn't recognize. These were his people. This was his neighborhood, and he had just ensured that it would stay that way. Bumpy reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He lit it slowly, inhaling deeply, feeling the smoke fill his lungs. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax. The war was over before it had begun. The arrangement. between Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson held for years. Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, but even from across the ocean he honored the agreement. His successors in the commission knew about the deal, knew about the photographs, and knew better than to test Harlem's defenses. Bumpy Johnson continued to run the numbers racket, continued to protect his community, continued to build an empire based not on fear alone, but on respect. He helped families pay their rent during hard times. He funded scholarships for neighborhood children. He settled disputes that might have turned violent with words instead of weapons. The Italian mob never forgot that night in the warehouse. For generations, they told the story of the black man who had faced down Lucky Luciano and walked away with everything he wanted. Some said it was luck, some said it was bluff. But those who knew Bumpy understood the truth. It wasn't luck, it wasn't bluff, it was preparation. It was patience. It was 3 years of gathering information while everyone else was making noise. Bumpy Johnson had won that night because he understood something that most people never learned. The most powerful weapon isn't a gun. It's knowing what your enemy fears most. Bumpy Johnson died on July 4th, 1968, of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. Thousands of people attended his funeral, from politicians to preachers to people he had helped over the decades. The Italian mob sent flowers. Lucky Luciano had died in Italy 2 years earlier, but the men who inherited his empire remembered the agreement. They remembered the photographs, and they remembered the lesson that Bumpy Johnson had taught them all. Respect isn't given, it's earned. Power isn't just about who has the most guns, it's about who has the most information. And courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to sit across from your enemy, outnumbered and outgunned, and make him blink first. That night in 1936, 4 killers walked into Harlem to end Bumpy Johnson's life. By morning, those same 4 killers were escorting him to a meeting with the most powerful mobster in America. And when the sun rose, Bumpy Johnson walked out with everything he came for. That's not luck. That's not bluff. That's legend. Bumpy Johnson walked into that warehouse alone, facing the most dangerous man in America, armed with nothing but photographs and nerve. He could have run. He could have hidden. He could have started a war that would have destroyed everything he loved. Instead, he chose strategy over violence, intelligence over force, and he won. Here's my question for you. What would you have done in Bumpy's position? Would you have trusted those photographs to save your life, or would you have chosen a different path? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe, because Bumpy Johnson has more stories to tell, and I'll see you in the next one.